Hi, welcome to Goth Nick and Goth Chick, where we discuss Gothic themes in media more generally. I'm your host, Nick Vanderwaard.
And I'm Lindsay Wheeler, the goth chick in this arrangement.
This episode, we'll be discussing the Uncanny.
Okay, so today's topic, the Uncanny.
The Uncanny. The Uncanny is definitely a key factor in Gothic stories. It's not always the main focus of Gothic stories, but it plays into a lot of them, and it really depends on the story in question. For instance, a writing trope that crops up time and time again in Gothic stories is doubles. So in Neo-Gothic revival novels like The Italian or The Monk, you would have a long-lost relative or someone who looked like a long-lost relative show up out of the blue. In those stories, they wouldn't necessarily be visible in such a way that you could compare them directly. Usually, it's kind of complicated, generally speaking convoluted, because in stories, more modern stories like The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, they'll put the character directly in front of you and almost test the audience in terms of what you're looking at. Is it uncanny or not? Is this person any different? And they'll invite you to try and figure out whether or not that's the case. Whereas in a lot of older Gothic novels, they would keep the uncanny at a distance. Like they're like, oh, I think I saw someone from really far away who looked like my long-lost uncle. And so that sense of doubling was generally from a distance. Mm-hmm. Whereas with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you're in a neighborhood where the characters all look like your neighbors, your friends, and family, and you're standing in front of them, you're having a conversation with them. So they're not far away, they're not occluded by mist, they're not concealed by darkness. They're in front of you, but something's wrong with them. Mm-hmm. And that's a more modern way, or a more recent way of doing the uncanny. But then there's also more direct or overt forms of the uncanny, because there's the subtle version of the uncanny where there's something slightly off with these characters. Like, oh, you know what? This character isn't laughing, or they're not smiling enough. They look like my neighbor, but there's just something slightly off about them in terms of their behavior or their emotions. They look like my neighbor, they don't really act like them 100%. Something's missing, but I can't quite put my finger on it. Mm-hmm. That's one form of the uncanny. Another form of the uncanny is where it's much more visually front and center, where you're forced to confront a character where there's something visually missing from their body, usually their face, because the face is where we tend to identify with other people in terms of the way that we emote when expressing ourselves, or when someone else is talking to us, they might smile or otherwise express themselves with their face. And that's a large part of the uncanny, where if you want to creep someone out, just kind of mess with the face a little bit. Change the eyes, change the smile so that it doesn't reach the eyes, that kind of like soulless sort of smile where just the mouth moves but the eyes continue to stare dead ahead. There's no expression.
Or make the proportions wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. You could have
the mouth or the eyes are too big or something.
Or missing.
Yes.
Yeah, in the case of Michael Myers from Halloween, is a really good example of a character who doesn't have eyes. And even without the mask, Michael Myers' character is described as having the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. Mm-hmm. But for 98% of that film, he's seen wearing a mask. And when he wears the mask, he has no eyes at all. It's just these dark holes. You're removing information to make his character more uncanny, which generally means less emotive, but not a complete lack of emotion. Usually there's enough information there to, at least from a glance, make him seem somewhat human. But certain pieces of information are deliberately left out. Yeah. So he's a really good example of an uncanny kind of slasher villain. Mm-hmm. Similar characters like Jason from Friday the 13th, where the hockey mask that he wears looks a little bit human. Like, it's not a ski mask or something. Well, even ski masks, you have the holes for eyes, you have the hole for the mouth, maybe even a hole for the nose. So masks of different types and varieties tend to have similar types of data that they connect from a glance. And if you start taking some of that away in a way that can't be described just as a mask, masks can be uncanny. And if you watch Keanu Reeves in Point Break, where he's going up against these surfers who are robbing banks while wearing masks, face masks of United States presidents like Nixon, same kind of idea. They almost seem like they're not human, or they're less human than they could be, because they have these sort of stiff, lifeless masks with the eyeballs cut out.
Right.
And generally there's a bit of darkness underneath the mask, so it's just like these dark, lifeless eyes. Coraline, where the character's eyes have been replaced with buttons. Messing with the eyes in particular is a great way to make that seem kind of uncanny. But you can also take away the entire face, make the entire face blank. Dr. Samuel Hayden from Doom 2016 is a large anthropomorphic robot with a very human-sounding voice, but he has a very blank face. It's a robotic head that's in the basic shape of a human skull, but it's lacking any kind of features at all. It just has sort of a blinking light in the center of the face. Not too far removed from Hal, as seen in 2001 A Space Odyssey, where it's just like a blinking light. But there's nothing else that's really there. You'll notice that there's actually a connection between the uncanny and robotics, or the uncanny and artificial intelligence. And
like the Uncanny Valley is used a lot in reference to attempts at making believable, very human androids, and which for the most part has not been successful, because there's always something off. And it usually is sometimes in the eyes, or just the way the mouth moves, but you can usually tell that what you're dealing with is not a human being.
There's something missing.
Right.
And there's an attempt to convey, oh, I am human, but then through interacting with this character, you realize that they're lacking something substantial. But where it gets interesting, especially in Gothic stories, where the imitation is largely successful and you can't tell the difference between a human and a imitation. In Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein and the creature were pretty hard to separate from each other, despite the obvious differences. The creature is 10 feet tall and incredibly fast and superhumanly strong, and for all accounts and purposes, indestructible. Whereas Victor Frankenstein is frail, he's easily excitable from a mental standpoint. There are so many points in the story where his senses are almost overloaded, and he's sort of sent into this catatonic state where his friend has to look after him and nurse him back to health for months on end because he looked at the creature for one moment and basically suffered sanity damage. And that was largely due to the uncanny, like the acute or the immediate kind of communication between them, where the creature looked at him for the first time and he realized the error of his ways. He thought he had made this beautiful creation, but the moment it opened its eyes, there was just something not human about them, which made him sorely regret his decision to create life to begin with. And the life that he had created in that story was, in some way or another, different, at least according to him. He saw it as a demon or a monster. But in Gothic stories, what's interesting is the confrontation between Victor and the creature will explain something. There's an abject quality to it. Abject is just a sense of, in order to make someone seem normal, you make someone else seem monstrous, or you make some other thing seem monstrous to make yourself seem human. But with the uncanny, there's generally a large amount of like confusion. And that's the main goal with the uncanny, is that it's meant to sort of communicate that there's something wrong, or that there's something confusing. in a way that your brain can't really wrap its head around.
Mm.
And Gothic stories tend to focus on that. And even science fiction stories, or Gothic stories with science fiction elements, like Alien, where you have Ash, the android, and you actually don't know that he's an android until most of the way through the movie. And then once they decapitate him, that starts to get uncanny in a certain kind of way. It's a different kind of uncanny, because normally if you want to do uncanny stuff, one of the most common ways to do that is the face. But in that film, they actually decapitate him with a baseball bat. They knock his head off, and then they put it on the table, and you have all these wires that they reroute to some alternate power source, and they turn him back on, and his head starts talking to the survivors. And that, in its own kind of way, is uncanny, because the moment he does, his affect is completely flat. He's sort of droning, and he's still the same character, and you realize that his human performance, which wasn't really perfect, because there are certain moments where he kind of drops the act a little bit if you know where to look.
Yeah.
But it's completely gone. And all that remains is the perfidious agent underneath. But what gets interesting about certain stories, even ones from the 1700s, like Father Shidoni from Anne Radcliffe's The Monk, is that these characters, these human characters in those stories, they didn't have androids back then. The closest thing they had was the creature from Frankenstein, which would have been 1818, which was the first edition of that novel. But before that, they may have had personified monsters, but they weren't like science fiction creations. Mary Shelley was very insistent that it was a creation of natural philosophy, which is just kind of a fancy, antiquated way of saying science.
Yes.
With a creature like Victor Frankenstein's monster versus Ash the android, where those are like simulacrums. They're made in man's image, but they were never human to begin with, and they're uncanny as a result of that. But you can have human characters like Father Shidoni in The Italian, where they're obviously human. The fact that they were a woman born is not thrown into doubt. But they're not acting in a way that seems very human. Like, they're psychopathic, they're very duplicitous, and they're trying to imitate the people around them to kind of blend in, but they're actually quite treacherous on the inside. And in that sense, it gets uncanny when you see them trying to fit in, but you realize that there's just something, especially about the face, but also the way that they move. Father Shidoni had like these dark, treacherous eyes, but he also would glide across the floor, almost like a ghost or something like that. And I'm like, nobody walks like that. It's a form of uncanny motion or body language. But the point of that confusion is to point out something relative to Shidoni where it's kind of a dead giveaway. Despite the fact that, he's Father Shidoni, he's a trustworthy monk, he's just an all-around great guy. Like, there are characters in the novel early on that attest to how wonderful of a member of the clergy he is. But then as the story goes on and you realize the character who doubts him at the very beginning, who has those uncanny feelings like there's something not quite right about Father Shidoni, you realize that they were right. The whole like Gothic side of that is the uncertainty that the uncanny affords. Whereas you might have a science fiction story like Data from Star Trek, where they're not focusing on the mystery beyond the uncanny. Like, is he an object of fear or not? There's an episode where they put Data on trial, and they're trying to determine should they destroy him or not, or what are the consequences of that. It's basically a trolley problem or an ethical dilemma in regards to taking Data offline or not. Is he human? Is he not human? And it's more like philosophical in nature. It has less to do with, are they afraid of him? Are they worried that he's going to kill them or not? Relative to his status as human versus post-human. Because the whole point, I think, with Data is he's also not trying to fool anyone. When you look at Data, you might feel a little bit creeped out by him because he doesn't emote like humans. He doesn't talk quite.
Well, his appearance is kind of uncanny too, because it's like it's pretty human, but the color's wrong. He has yellow eyes.
He doesn't blink, I don't think, or if he does, it's very seldom.
Yeah.
He doesn't...
Kind of waxy looking skin.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of these things you just described are essentially a description of the creature from Frankenstein,
Mm-hmm.
you know, where his complexion was off. He almost looks like a corpse. Data looks like a corpse. And that notion of him not being natural, being synthetic, or corpse-like. Mm-hmm. Now, the Gothic would totally use that as an argument to say that he's treacherous or that there's something perfidious about him.
Yeah.
And that mystery, that sort of ambivalence, do we trust him, do we not trust him, is centered around the problem, is he going to kill us or not? Is he human like us? Or if we let him go, is he actually a psychopath? Is there something sort of post-human about him in a way that's going to impact us or the human race in a not-so-good way? Victor Frankenstein had to deal with that, where he's like, okay, if I do what you say, if I help you, are you going to kill not just me, but humanity in general? That film we watched, Ex Machina, where it's uncanny enough when you're just looking at the antagonist of the film, wherein she doesn't have all of her skin. She's like, she has a human face, but the rest of it is like machine, very obviously machine.
Right.
And that can be kind of uncanny by itself. But what's most uncanny is just, if I let you go, will you kill me? No, I won't kill you.
Yeah.
Stay here. She asks the protagonist to stay in his room, and he does, and she leaves him there to die.
Yeah.
There's no kind of outward treachery. She doesn't like grin mischievously when she does it. She just she doesn't even really look at him. She just leaves. And then when she goes upstairs and she realizes that she's free, she starts smiling and giggling like a little girl. And that music is playing in the background, that sort of lullaby, where you have like the xylophones and the piano, and she's all happy and giddy, where he's trapped down in that room and he's gonna die. That kind of behavior can be uncanny as well. And you realize, what are her intentions towards the human race? And that uncanny sort of persists, because it's difficult to get a read on her, even though she just stabbed a guy to death with a knife. She killed her maker, and then she left her ostensible lover down in this bunker to starve to death. Then she goes off and to do a little people watching at the very end of the movie, and you think, all right, I think we have this character figured out. But we don't really, because what does she have planned? Because everything we know about her is through her experience inside the room.
Right.
And her effort to sort of escape that, and you think that might sort of sum her up. But because it's an uncanny kind of character, you feel like you can never really get a read on the character. You can never put your finger on them. And the Gothic would stress that post-human kind of uncanniness in a way that is sort of insidious.
Yeah.
Like, there's always a feeling of perceived danger relative to that unknown.
Another example that came to mind as far as uncanny in film, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. Jack Nicholson's character, as he's sliding into madness. You know, it's subtle at first. And
Yes.
There's something wrong with him, but it's hard to tell exactly what. At first, he just seems kind of stressed or something. And, but, yeah, and, you know, the family hasn't quite... They know something's wrong, but haven't quite figured it out either. It's hard to say they've really even figured anything out by the end of it. They just know that they need to get away from him.
The uncanny, as far as that goes, where uncanny coming from Freud's notion of unheimlich or unhomely.
Yeah.
And there's a sense of the domestic in The Shining, where they go to this faraway place to be stewards during the winter. During that time, Jack Torrance comes to realize that he's always been the caretaker. You've always been the caretaker, sir. And it gets kind of confusing in that there's some sort of spectral projection going on, where is Jack Torrance, was he a person? Is he just a ghost? Was he always a ghost? You're not really sure where one begins and the other ends. But the notion of uncanny in his case is this sense of creeping insanity
Mm-hmm.
relative to this space that's affecting him in a way that you don't know exactly what, but you get the feeling that it's not good.
Oh, yeah.
And there's something wrong with the space, but you're intuiting that through a character that you can't read properly.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, even at the very start of the film, he seems like he has kind of a subdued anger about him.
Yeah, he definitely is a very intense dude. So in the beginning, it's kind of hard to tell whether he's just like in a bad mood or...
And maybe that makes it easier for the house to affect him.
Yeah.
But notice that sense of doubling, right?
Yeah.
Where he already starts off as kind of an ambiguous and somewhat untrustworthy character.
Mm.
And it fits perfectly with the film's use of him as this unreliable protagonist. Just the protagonist in the sense of the central character of the film, ostensibly.
You're right.
We spend all of this time with him, and his demeanor definitely changes throughout the film, but it's very subdued. It's a very subtle form of the uncanny, and you spend just as much time with the house as you do Jack Torrance. The house doesn't really change all that much. You know, it doesn't like come alive and start throwing things at him. All of the effects that the house exudes in a way that's noticeable is like in a tangible, overt kind of way are experienced through Jack. But Jack is not always the fastest to react. I mean, it takes most of the movie for him to decide to grab the axe and start chopping down the door.
Yeah.
And at that point, he's already been hit in the head with a baseball bat and locked in the freezer.
Mm.
And he's had multiple conversations with the bartender. And
I mean, the kids had hallucinations too. So I guess that's one other character that the house has been...
yeah, that film is an interesting case where it has a very kind of inert female character, at least like a supernaturally inert female character, where she just doesn't pick up on things. She's very aloof, and she doesn't see any of these things until the very end, where the elevator door opens, and the blood kind of pours out. She sees the former caretaker of the hotel, and his head has been blasted apart but kind of put back together, and there's the whole teddy bear suit scene. There's just all of these things that start to present themselves as horrifically wrong at the very end, and the house isn't even trying to be subtle at that point. And Jack Torrance is kind of our way to tap into that space.
Mm-hmm.
He's a personification of like a spiritual tracker of sorts, where we read the gradual change of the house in a noticeable way through his affect.
He's almost like a medium.
A medium, yeah, exactly. And as things progressively get worse, Jack progressively gets worse, but it stays uncanny through him as a person. So not just the house seeming kind of weird, but him seeming kind of weird in a way that we're not really sure one way or the other. Once he grabs the axe, the jig is up. You know, it's like, okay, at that point, it's not uncanny. He's a axe-wielding maniac. But there's a scene earlier in the film where he's sitting in bed and he's just kind of like disheveled and wearing a bathrobe, and it's this intense blue morning light. Mm-hmm. And he looks like he hasn't slept in a couple of days. And he takes Danny and says, "Danny, you know I love you, right? I'd never hurt you. This is our home now." And the way he's talking is like very uncanny.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you'll notice that he's not frothing at the mouth, but he's also not very welcoming either. Like, he's not totally repulsive, but he's not totally welcoming.
It's awfully suspicious.
Yeah, it's instead of being like homely or just totally not homely, he's sort of like unhomely, like again in the middle. Mm-hmm. If he's the medium of the space, like his job, the way that Kubrick has employed him anyways, is to be uncanny.
Yes.
And so yeah, Jack Torrance is a great example of an uncanny person relative to an uncanny space in an uncanny Gothic kind of story, where Gothic in the sense of this reoccurring nightmare inside this space where there's some kind of hidden trauma, there's a perceived sense of danger. And The Shining is great because you never feel safe.
Oh, yeah.
In that hotel.
Oh, yeah.
but you also can't really tell where the danger is, and the only indicator of it is Jack, for the most part. I mean, at the very end, things start to get weird, and of course, Danny's character is able to see these things much earlier than anyone else, before they even go there. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, Wendy is just kind of along for the ride. She's the Gothic heroine in the classical sense, where she's just kind of stumbling around blind. She's the passive, beautiful object. The Shining is a great use of the uncanny, because in order for it to work, you can't break the spell. You know, you can't have Jack Nicholson look at the camera and be like, and wink. You know, it has to be like a maintained feeling of... Mm-hmm. You can't have the actor who played Data from Star Trek start laughing and smiling like an actual person. You know, you have to maintain the facade.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point of the uncanny, is it is a facade. What lurks behind? And it almost serves as a barrier to occlude something. And in the case of Data, he's a good character from what I understand. He's not malign in any case. In his case, he's post-human, so he doesn't quite think like humans do. He doesn't have emotions, but he serves humanity's interests.
Right.
Whereas someone like Michael Myers is a killing machine of sorts. But when you look at him, you feel a similar type of uncanny. I mean, you feel a similar sense of ambivalence through the uncanny that you would with Data or you would with Jack Torrance. I mean, obviously there are different ways that you can sort of carry it in terms of, like, Michael Myers wears a mask, Data has a corpse-like appearance, and Jack Torrance is, well, there's something wrong with him. Like, he's sleep deprived and he's under the effects of spirits. But so cosmetically, each one of them is different, and the man behind the mask, or the as Anne Radcliffe would put it, the dreaded evil. Behind the mask is different for each one of them, but that feeling of mystery relative to something that you think you should recognize but don't, as a result of it being the uncanny, those basic principles don't change for any of those characters. And obviously there's a lot of wiggle room, because you have a science fiction story, you have a slasher story, and then you have Kubrick's, for all intents and purposes, a ghost story. There's a lot of room and potential for the uncanny to be used in different ways. And that science fiction element in Ex Machina, where I almost wish that Ex Machina was more of a horror movie, just like in terms of like the Gothic sense, like they were in a castle or something like that, because if they did, it would basically be Frankenstein. But instead they take away all of that and they make it seem kind of glossy, and it's not hyper futuristic, but it's swept clean in a very Kubrick kind of way, where there's no dust. The clean room trope in sci-fi is something that always bothers me, because you don't really see that much outside of laboratories. So in this case, this is this dude's like hideaway, his little like kind of it's his home. Yeah, he's essentially a shut-in. The notion of the mad scientist as isolated from his peers so he can do his work more effectively, that it also leads to certain problems. In Ex Machina's case, where he's teaching the artificial intelligence how to be human by trapping it in a maze, like, and forcing it to be as treacherous as possible in order to escape. Like, it's a very abusive relationship between him and his creation. And that application of technology in a very Promethean kind of way. And that was the whole point of Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. I wanted to try and think of some examples of things that you might think would be uncanny in science fiction or Gothic stories, but aren't. Although I did want to switch from film to another medium for a bit. Well, I mean, just like in any other form of storytelling, video games can also invoke the uncanny intentionally through the story arc, but I just wanted to bring up the uncanny aspect of glitches. Even though it's not something that's supposed to be happening, there's this weird sort of malign feeling to them sometimes. When it's subtle or just kind of... like, it's definitely something that's not supposed to be happening, and... Doki Doki Literature
I
Club.
was about to bring that one up. Yeah, it breaks the fourth wall quite a bit, but in a very eerie sort of way.
Exactly, and the message that it's connoting through its own dissonance is malign.
Yes.
But you don't know exactly what it is, just that you're getting a bad feeling is essentially that kind of uncanny relative to glitches, where it would be like if you and I were talking right now and then suddenly I glitched out and almost like I was recording, or my internal mechanisms just short-circuited, and then I might stop like talking.
You clip through the chair.
And then after a second or two, I sort of unfreeze, and then I act like nothing was wrong.
Yeah.
But for that moment, while you're waiting for me to confirm whether or not I'm actually a psychotic android or recording or anything else that might intimate that something sinister is going on, that's the uncanny.
Yeah.
Where it's a suggestion that something is wrong or something is off in a way that's confusing, that extends the mystery, at least in a Gothic sense. And science fiction, they would try and do away with the mystery and just leave you with the conundrum. Is Data human or not? And they would just sort of present it in clear, unambiguous terms. Whereas the Gothic isn't about that at all. It's about confusing you and kind of occluding things. It'll reveal just enough information to give you a million more questions, most of which are, what's going on? Is this thing going to hurt me? Is it a friend or is it a foe? And you feel like you oscillate between wanting to accept the situation but also wanting to reject it and get the hell out. And glitches, there was a game called Axiom Verge that I remember playing that actually had glitches as a part of its experience, where the character, some of the equipment that you would find in the game would allow you to glitch through walls. And at the end of the day, it's basically just a sort of a teleport mechanic, but it was very deliberately portrayed in a cosmetic sense as glitchy. Like the world that you're interacting with, this technology allows you to sort of glitch through the world. And there would even be these points where you would sort of touch this location and you would be magically teleported to the same world, but it would have all of these old graphical appearances that for all intents and purposes are glitchy. Just there are certain ways that if you take the Nintendo Entertainment System, a cartridge based platform like that, and you would play Mario, the way that the graphics would render in real time, there's just certain ways that the scrolling graphics would sort of appear on a CRT monitor or television screen. They would render a very particular way. And it was interesting because in these sort of glitchy sort of spheres or states that you would enter, in Axiom Verge, the maker of the game, Thomas Hatt, actually tried to make it appear as though you were trapped inside this glitched state. But what's interesting is this glitched state was effectively the reconstruction of an old video game. And there would just be so much attention and detail went into that. And again, it's the deliberate inclusion of elements that are meant to make you feel, in that case it was actually kind of nostalgic, but it can just as easily be uncanny, where things that throw the sense of normal or the sense of familiarity or the sense of safety, anything where normal, safe, good, healthy, happy, where it kind of pulls you towards the direction of its opposite in terms of a dichotomy, like good, evil, safe, dangerous, except in the Gothic, it's all going to be stuck in the middle. And there are going to be these constant intimations of danger, but there's never a confirmation of it actually being so until, like, the very end. I think that kind of thing, as far as glitches in video games goes, has to be more deliberate. Like Doki Doki Literature Club, where they have something in mind with the glitches.
Undertale also did a kind of similar thing with breaking the fourth wall and messing with your perception of the game later on. But in fact, after that, that's been like a lot of indie game designers have been kind of playing with that sort of concept where you have to go into the game files and figure out what's going wrong there. But as far as like unintentional, like non-narrative glitches, just that sort of eerie feeling you get when it's just like, that character shouldn't be there.
Mm-hmm.
You've played this game before, this shouldn't be happening. Or even if you haven't, like, just sometimes it's just kind of eerie when maybe their face didn't load. You still see the eyeballs and the teeth.
Yes.
Like, you know, like that was a major thing in Fallout.
Yeah, definitely.
And then there's the classic glitches in Red Dead Redemption of, like, Cougar Man.
Yes.
Where you have, or the bird people. You basically have animals in the game that, it's still behaving. It has an AI of the animal, but it's skinned as a human.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's uncanny too, because on one hand they look familiar, they look human,
right?
But there's a sense of unfamiliarity in regards to their behavior, and it's confusing because in a certain way they're behaving like a cougar would, but they look like a human when they shouldn't look like a cougar. Like, it confuses you, like, immediately when you see them, and that never really goes away.
Yeah.
No matter how hard you look at it, you think you're going to be able to make sense of it, but you can't.
Right.
And that's the wonderful thing about the uncanny, is that it's very hard to dispel. Like, you can't look at Michael Myers, or you can't look at one of these other instances of the uncanny from, like, a visual standpoint, and then suddenly lose that feeling of the uncanny. Like, it's just, you meet the right amount of information and the right lack of information, and it simply is uncanny. And there's just no way to really, even if you told the audience that, don't worry guys, he's perfectly safe, I assure you. And you're like, okay, I don't feel safe though. And it's one reason it's just a really popular kind of storytelling device in Gothic stories, where you have all of these mysteries that you're trying to promote and extend for as long as possible. And one way to do that is just make the villain uncanny, where if the whole story revolves around the idea, is this character safe? Is this character trustworthy? But you never can tell from a visual standpoint, because when you look at them, well, they're uncanny.
Well, in the case of some of Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees, like, you have something that looks basically like a human. I mean, one head, 2 arms, 2 legs, torso.
It's humanoid.
Humanoid, but can you kill it like a human? Like, you know?
Yeah.
Does it still, like, do the normal rules of human biology still apply to this thing? And
of course, in slasher films, there is definitely a supernatural element. In Halloween, the shape quite literally teleports from spot to spot. It doesn't obey the laws of physics, and he's able to, like, go through walls and things. But it's not done in such a way that you can see it happening. He just always conveniently can appear behind Laurie, but he does it through the cloak of darkness. So there's this wonderful sense of the uncanny, but also just this ability for people to imagine, like, how is he doing this? You know, while they're being bombarded by this mask looking at them in the dark. It's really effective. And another interesting thing about the uncanny relative to classic Gothic villains, the classic Gothic villain in the old Gothic novels, they would be humanoid, they would be hulking and dark. So Father Shidoni, when he's out on the beach and he's going to kill, I think her name was Elena Rosaba, and she was the princess in disguise, basically. And he's like, okay, I'm totally going to kill you right now. Yep. No, he's watching her. At that point, he's watching her and he's thinking about killing her. It's that stalking moment, like Laurie Strode in Halloween, where she sees Michael Myers from a distance and she doesn't know what's going on because she's in a classroom and he's just standing across the street. And then later he appears in the house and he's trying to kill her with a knife. Same idea in the Italian, when Elena is forced to confront Father Shidoni. She sees him on the beach and he's just kind of watching her. But the one thing that is stressed about that character is that he's like a man, but he's big and dark and powerful. And if I remember correctly, Mount Vesuvius is in the background, and this is a large sort of volcano, and it's just kind of burning. And it's supposed to be like a metaphor for, like, masculinity or something like that. There are a lot of, like, very overt symbols for male and female and masculine and feminine in those stories. But the sense of, like, a masculine dark power, any of the slashers that you can think of, generally they're a large, tall, dark, humanoid sort of shape. And that, in and of itself, is an uncanny thing where the focus isn't the face, where instead you just see a silhouette, or in the case of Michael Myers, he was literally called the Shape. But it's a humanoid shape. But again, it's uncanny because when you look at it, there's just enough information to give you the sense of familiarity in regards to the outline. But then, is it safe? Is it not safe? Well, you won't know until they step into the light. But of course, in Gothic stories, they never do. They always stay in the shadows. And in regards to them being slashers, you start to ask questions like, oh, can we kill it with fire? Can we shoot it or stab it or do anything to dispatch it normally? But when they're in the dark like that and when they're uncanny, they almost seem invincible. Yeah. You know, it has a really profound effect, fight or flight, you know, where you're just kind of stuck in the middle and you don't really know how to respond. Whereas I think if a science fiction story was treating the same material, it would be less about that and more, oh, look, Arnold Schwarzenegger's a Terminator, and he can just walk into the bar and throw everyone around like rag dolls, and, oh, you can stab him with a knife, but, well, he has a hyper-alloy combat chassis endoskeleton, you know, and surrounded by living tissue. Like, there would be no sense of the uncanny in quite the same way. And even his, the way they play him in that, he's almost the straight man in that movie. He's not uncanny at all because or he's a lot less uncanny in regards to his performance. There's the sense of he looks human and he's lacking emotion, like he has a flat affect, which is uncanny. But you'll notice that despite the fact that they acknowledge that he's not human, like he's either too strong or too fast or he can't cry, he never really feels uncanny. In the case of something where they are trying to present the uncanny in science fiction, they treat it more as a philosophical problem, like, oh, is data human or not? Is this the singularity, you know, the technological singularity, as opposed to, should I run or should I hide? Is this going to kill me or not? What is that thing I see in the darkness? It looks human. So the Gothic tends to focus more on stuff like that, questions of like immediate danger, like friend or foe.
And also, like, tying into the friend or foe, like, even if you know it's foe, sometimes you don't know what it's going to do. It's not going to be good, but you don't know exactly what flavor of terrible is coming your way. Like, you know, in a slasher, it's pretty clear that it's going to catch you and kill you, and it's probably going to hack you up.
Yeah, it's a machete. Well, they call them slashers for a reason.
Exactly, yeah. Whereas sometimes you have something that's like so alien that you don't really know what it plans to do with you.
Well, when we were watching It Follows, the one scene in the movie that really works, the most uncanny scene of all, is the one where you feel like you're in danger, but you don't know what it's going to do to you. When the naked alien is walking towards you and you're like, okay. And it's not concealed by darkness either. I mean, it's a night scene and there's some shadows and things, but it looks human. There's no way to. It's not just a dark shape. And but I remember you telling me that you're like, oh, this is really unsettling, or this is just really unnerving because you don't know what it's going to do to the girl. You know that it's bad. Yeah. And I guess actually, to be entirely honest, you are actually told what it's going to do earlier in the movie because the girl who's killed on the beach is torn limb from limb. Yeah. But what's interesting about that scene is it makes you forget that because of the uncanny elements. And that's when you know that you've really hit that sweet spot, that uncanny sweet spot. Despite the fact that you're told something, the uncanny confuses what you know. Like you think, oh, well, it's going to tear you apart. Don't worry. And you're like, no, I'm worried. I don't think it's going to do that. I don't know what it's going to do. I'm confused right now. Yeah. That's I think some of the best examples of the uncanny.
And that movie also had a great example of like the double, because she's looking out the window and sees her neighbor walking down the street towards his own house.
Oh, right.
Until he picks up like a rock and breaks his window, and then it's like, oh, that's not him at all. That's the thing, and it's coming for him. And
doubling is kind of complex because I mean, in that case, like it's a very overt form of doubling, like where it's almost like a quick skin, where because the monster in that case can change form at will.
Yeah.
And but then there are instances where it's not actually a shapeshifter; it's just someone. It's a case of like mistaken identity, or something like that. Well, because a lot of classic Gothic novels would deal with that. Mistaken or stolen identity. Father Schedoni in the Italian was actually the evil brother of the Conte di Brusso, who he murdered, assumed his identity, bankrupted himself, and then became a priest. And he's also a false priest. It's very convoluted, very convoluted plot, and it gets even more complex because when he sees Elena Rosalba, he sees a pendant where it has a likeness or a miniature, which is just like a tiny little drawing, and it looks like him. But here's the thing, he's actually seeing his brother. But because of the quality of the illustration, I mean, this is the 1700s, he thinks that he sees himself when he is actually confusing himself with his brother, and he thinks that she must be his daughter, even though he had a daughter, but she died at childbirth, and it's actually his niece. So there's all this like really weird doubling going on.
Yeah. And
that's not something that you see in most modern films. You don't see it to quite the same extent. But doubling can be uncanny, and in that case it would be, because you see the guy walking down the street, but there's this weird sense of something's not right, because he's like walking down the street and his gait is wrong, and like it's just kind of robotic and purposeful in a way that the character in the movie, like when he walks, he slouches or he runs. There's some variation, but with that, it's just kind of mechanical. It's just moving in a straight line. It's wearing this weird pair of pajamas that almost look anachronistic or something like that. Like it's not like it almost doesn't have enough information to fully process the lie before performing. But at the same time, it knows that the people who see it are watching. You know, and because why assume a disguise like that unless somebody can see it?
Yeah.
So it knows, like sometimes I think it disguises itself as those that we love just to hurt us. You know, so it's a very malign kind of performance.
Oh, and it follows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. The uncanny is almost a weapon.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it's an effective one because instead of running away or fighting, the character is confused, which causes them to freeze in place, which allows the thing to move in for the kill. I mean, because if you want to be the most effective predator, you don't want your prey to fight back, but you don't also want them to run away. Instead, you're uncanny in such a way that just causes the prey to become confused. Think about the moth, right? Flying around the light.
Actually, what comes to mind is, I believe stoats will basically like act like it's dying, just put on this weird performance of just flailing around, and its prey will just kind of like sit there and stare at it. But it'll, flop its way over closer and closer to the prey, and then eventually get it and kill it.
Yeah. There's this sense of, oh, well, should I fight? Should I run away? By the time they sort of realize that they've been had,
it's too late.
It's too late. Yeah, absolutely. Or certain types of, what are those fish? Anglerfish, where they have the light that they'll dangle in front of their prey, and the prey will come and investigate. But imagine that instead of it just being like a light, but what if it dangled like someone that you loved or knew? Like, oh look, here, it's your mother. Oh, hi, Mom. Wait, something's not quite right. Mom, are you okay? You're acting kind of funny. That's the T-1000 in Terminator 2, where it's a really effective technique to be able to disguise itself as someone that you know and love. By the time it gets that close to you, you're basically dead. But assuming that it's not able to attack you right away, it's all an attempt for it to get as close as it can to you as possible, and then it springs the trap. And, I'm trying to think of something, because there's a term, it's not the uncanny valley, but it's the canny valley. The uncanny valley is that moment where you feel like something is wrong. The canny valley is where someone would tell you, oh, actually, that's a robot. Or actually, that's not your mother. that's a recording.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't tell the difference. There is no confusion. There is no liminal experience. So something with the ultimate predator should actually do that. It would be able to just walk right up to you as an infiltrator type unit. The Terminator is an infiltrator unit.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about it is that the disguise is imperfect. There's just it's almost impossible to fool someone. So it's relying on its uncanniness to be able to get past your basic defenses. If you do feel like something's wrong, then it can just zoom in and kill you before you find the good sense to run. But with the Canny Valley, you'd have no idea that you were dealing with something treacherous.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting about Gothic stories is that the monster is always uncanny. It would never choose to be canny, like the sense of, well, the disguise is so perfect that you never feel ill at ease. Because that's the whole point of watching The Shining, right?
Yeah.
You want to feel creeped out. Or the Terminator, a slasher film. That's kind of the reason that you buy the ticket.
Or like The Thing. I mean, it does a pretty good job of mimicking its...
That's probably a good argument for the Canny Valley.
Yeah.
Because Palmer is... The imitation is so close to perfect that you can't tell that he's an imitation or not. That's why that jump scare is so effective.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're
testing the blood. Like, you, as an audience member, you have no idea either.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are uncanny moments, but generally speaking, it's more about... It's more subtle in certain ways, and the moments of the uncanny are actually once the monster has been found out, where... There's one character who is sort of taken by the monster, and they're like, oh, it's got Bennings, so they run over, and Bennings is kneeling in the snow, or what they think is Bennings is kneeling in the snow, but then they shine a light on it, and its hand is like one of its arms is like, there's something really wrong with it, and when it opens its mouth, it can't speak because it's still trying to process Bennings and imitate him. That's uncanny.
Yeah.
Whereas the imitation in that film is so close to perfect that you have to look for other clues besides the person themselves to realize that there's something wrong with them. You have to sort of fact check. Whereas with the uncanny, you're not so much fact checking as going with a gut reaction or a gut response. And you're kind of stuck in the middle. Now, I'm not saying that the thing isn't uncanny, because it has plenty of moments. But it's also kind of a rare film of its type that has the Canny Valley, where they don't try, and they hide the monster so well that you actually aren't sure who it is. And I think in that case, the biggest sign that something is wrong is the music. Or the music, or the fact that the science facility is creepy as hell. That's another instance. Instead of Jack Torrance, where you have the medium who's kind of presenting this spiritual invasion of the space, which is affecting us, and you can see it on Jack, on the surface of Jack. It kind of coincides with the space itself, the Overlook Hotel, as being just kind of creepy or unsettling. But in the case of the crew in The Thing, in that case, it's a creepy kind of place. And then there's the non-diegetic music that's playing, that's reminding us that something is wrong. That's uncanny. That doesn't even try and be canny at all. But what's interesting is, in that case, how apparently normal some of these characters are, where, they don't seem freaked out at all. So it's very different than Jack Torrance, where Jack Torrance is very obviously being affected by the space around him. Whereas the characters in The Thing are doing a much better job at hiding the fact that they're monsters, or that something is wrong with them. So they still attack each other. They're like, oh, well, I think you're the Thing. No, you're the Thing. And you have no idea who's who, but not because it's uncanny. In that case, because there is no warning sign. I've seen videos of visual clues, like, supposedly they didn't have a light shining on Palmer's eyes, basically like a rim light or something like that, where it creates like a little mote of light in the actor's eye, just to make it more photographically pleasing. And there's a theory out there that that's supposed to be the clue that he's the thing. But see how subtle that is?
If it's that subtle, I mean, the audience, if you have to like point that out, then clearly it's not noticeable enough to count as a hint, you know?
It's not really uncanny, because the whole point of the uncanny is it's supposed to draw your attention to them. Like there's something wrong with his face and he's like twitching or something like that. Or he has this dark aura around him. A dark aura, you can't go wrong with that. Or there's just something wrong with his affect. There's one character who looks after the dogs in the thing who has kind of a flat voice. Like, oh, he just kind of talks like this. Yeah, sure. But he always talks like that. Yeah. Now, if it were uncanny, then he would have talked normal, and then suddenly he starts talking in this weird kind of flat affect. That would be uncanny. But he talks like that before the alien invasion takes place. And again, so it might seem like it's uncanny, but it's not. And there's no change in any of the characters' personalities because the alien is imitating them perfectly. And it's only in moments where it's caught with its pants down, effectively, or it's breaking from the disguise to attack. See how it's almost a disadvantage for the monster to have that perfect disguise? Well, in its case, there's a physiological sort of thing where it has to transition from its perfect disguise into its killing form. But the thing about a slasher, or the thing about some of these uncanny killers, is they're lethal. They're always in a state of combat readiness because they're in an uncanny state. You know, they give off that dangerous vibe because they have the knife, they're holding it in their hand, and they put it behind their back, and they're like, okay, something like that, let's say. But all it takes is 1 second for them to pull it out and then stab you to death. Whereas the thing, in that canny state, it has to transform into a monster before it can kill you. Of course, there are a couple of kills in the movie where the kill is very fast, where Doc comes up behind the guy and puts the hand in his mouth and like stretches his face out. He kills him almost instantly. And I kind of wonder why the monster just didn't do that to everyone in the movie. Like, if it's that strong and that fast, why bother with a disguise? And of course, that's the Gothic side of things. You know, it's supposed to be an exercise in making people feel like not very good. But for the most part, in the movie, the wolf, when they put it in the pen with all the other wolves, and
they're huskies, I believe.
Huskies, right? Okay, huskies. So you have the husky, and they put it in the pen with the other huskies, and it has to transform before it can attack them. When it's doing this, it's kind of vulnerable, you know, like it takes time for it to transform, and by the time it does, the crew has gotten there with their flamethrowers and their shotguns, and they're able to sort of paralyze it. You know, they light it on fire, and then they blow out the flames, and then they're able to cart it off. And it's not the most effective killing machine. Like, it's really effective at imitating things, but it's kind of chaotic. Whereas, again, a lot of slashers, they tend to focus more on using the uncanny as a paralyzing agent, and then just pulling out the weapon that they have at the ready anyways, and then just, stabbing you or ripping your head off or doing whatever it is they're going to do. You'll notice, like, how lethal most, like, Gothic monsters are. Like, they're either incredibly strong, or their body is made of weapons, like blades or stabbing objects. Or in It Follows, it seems like the moment it touches you, it, like, fries you or something like that. Like, they're almost instantly fatal. Whereas the Thing, it seems like it has to kind of take its time a little bit to process someone. Like, it has to get them alone. But supposedly it has this ability to infect you through contamination. So, like, one cell can invade and multiply like a cancer inside someone. But as far as I can tell, everyone in the film is exposed to the creature much more aggressively than that. And it's almost, from a hunting standpoint, more effective for the monster to be confusing, you know, as opposed to, like, because if you're just sort of relaxed or you don't feel that confusion, you know, you're actually free to kind of respond, you know, like, it's not paralytic. It doesn't have a paralyzing quality to it. Most Gothic villains, most monsters are hunters. They are predators in some shape or form. They're predatory. Even something like the character from Ex Machina, where it's this beautiful woman. They say it's a rat in a maze, but it's a very dangerous rat. You know, it's ostensibly harmless. It's ostensibly a woman. You know, it's smaller, it's weaker than the male character, and there's even a point when they're fighting in the hallway, and it seems like she's at a disadvantage. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, she's incredibly treacherous. Mm-hmm. But she doesn't appear that way. Mm-hmm. And that's what makes it effective. It makes people let their guard down. Whereas if someone's the canny belly, almost makes the thing a less effective predator to a certain extent. It's really good at confusing the shit out of people, but not in an uncanny way.
Back to Ex Machina, like, we brought that up earlier in terms of the uncanny quality of the android, because, you know, she has the human face, but exposed mechanical workings. Yeah,
she has transparent skin.
Right. So it's like this thing that's clearly not human, wearing a human facade, but just like, I guess the most important place, the face, as far as like interfacing with other human beings. Yeah. But at the same time, I guess it has a bit of a canny quality too, just because
when she puts on the rest of her at the end of the movie, when she puts on the skin and she looks human, the disguise is so effective that you can't tell the difference or not.
Well, there's that too, but also when you mentioned the how things are canny when like it's really blatant, and
like the canny valley tends to pertain more to imitations that are so successful that they aren't uncanny versus things that aren't even trying to fool you to begin with. Yeah. That's more what that has to do with, where instead of the uncanny valley is the failure of an attempt to appear human, the canny valley is the success.
Okay, yeah.
Here's the genius part about something like that, is there are instances where special effects are so good now that you can't tell if something is fake or not. Oh, yeah. So in Blade Runner 2049, they literally recreated the actress Sean Young in such a way that you can't tell if she is, at least from a visual standpoint, she looks real. There's still kind of a still quality to them, like there's so much work that goes into doing it, and motion and certain kind of effects like rain and just particle effects and things that are difficult to animate might not be happening, but you can't tell based on how they look physically. You have to look for other things around them to hypothesize. Yeah. Terminator Dark Fate, when John Connor, played by Eddie Furlong, is killed at the start of the film, the young version of Eddie Furlong is completely computer generated. And from what I understand, like, they have a body double, but they animate everything over him in such a way. But in the case of Rachel from Blade Runner 2049, it was completely computer generated. Yeah. And as a test, they actually recreated scenes from the original movie where they recreated Rachel to such a degree that you couldn't tell if she was or wasn't actually Sean Young. And that's the canny valley. Yeah. Now, the uncanny valley is when they get something wrong, or the disguise is imperfect. Where it gets fun is if that's a weaponized technique. You know, like if it's a deliberate technique to make you sort of freeze in place.
I guess something could also become uncanny despite being a perfect replica if, say, unlike the thing that kind of takes over the body of whatever it comes in contact with, if they make themselves a copy but leave the body behind or something. Yes. Like if you see somebody that's supposed to be, you already know is supposed to be dead and they're walking around.
Oh, yeah.
Or if you've been interacting with this person for a while and then you find the long dead body of the person that they've assumed the identity of.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's a classic science fiction story. I can't remember the name of it, but these people go to Mars, but when they arrive there, they find a perfect copy of their hometown with all of their family. It's perfect in the sense of when they look at everything, the imitation is seamless. Yeah. They can't tell based on how the people appear. It's the context that's wrong in that case. So it goes, actually, in terms of the uncanny versus the canny, it doesn't just have to do with the character in front of you, but also their environment. Yeah. And going back to The Shining, Jack Torrance and the Overlook Hotel are in constant relationship with one another. It's almost like symbiotic. The uncanny is a result of both working together. to create a feeling of the uncanny, in the same sense that the thing has this perfect imitation, but the uncanny doesn't stem from you looking at the imitation and getting the feeling that something is wrong. Because someone could even tell you, and in point in fact, people say, oh, he's the imitation. You don't believe them because the imitation is so perfect.
Yeah.
Instead, the uncanny comes from their relationship to the environment around them, which, for us, the audience, includes the spooky music, which clues you in such a way to put you on edge. The uncanny valley is all of that together, and the canny valley would be that too. Like if the environment were such where there were no clues at all. If someone came along and said, oh, your neighbor is a space alien, in order for the alien to reveal itself, it's going to have to get uncanny sooner or later.
Yeah.
So it's, again, that idea of the thing where in order for it to show, okay, if you're an alien, show me you're an alien, then things really start to get uncanny, you know, because then it starts to like transform, and then you're like, oh my God. But up until that point, you know, you're just kind of like, the thing that's unsettling in that movie, apart from the music and the dark lighting and just all the fucked up shit that happens in that movie, is more the paranoia. Yeah. You know, the way that the characters are treating each other as humans.
I mean, that's almost always the theme, what things boil down to in like a zombie movie. Yeah, the zombies are a danger, but really the real danger is the...
Exactly, yeah. And some of the most fucked up stuff that happens in The Thing is just what they're doing to each other when they think that so-and-so is the thing.
Right. Well, I guess back to zombies, they're sort of... like, they're typically very clearly no longer the person they were.
Yes.
Yet, inevitably, there's always one person faced with a shambling corpse of their loved one that hesitates.
Yes.
Because there's just enough of a resemblance left that they just can't do it when they need to do it, as far as, delivering the lethal blow.
Sure, the Night of the Living Dead, the little girl, and then the mother, faced with her own daughter, is unable to fight back. And so the girl picks up a trowel. For some reason, she picks up a trowel.
Yeah.
And she stabs her mother to death. That's actually one of my favorite scenes in any George Romero movie. It's just that scene. Because it's a really effective hunting tool where the girl herself is really ineffective. As, you know, it's like she's not really that dangerous. But if you're just kind of paralyzed, she's able to walk up to you and slowly stab you to death with a trowel.
The little boy in Pet Sematary, the original movie adaptation. I haven't seen the remake. But the kid was the creepiest thing about that movie to me, because he's dead, then he's back, and I think he had a scalpel or some kind of small knife that he was like, which a toddler with a scalpel. Usually, if it wasn't undead, would just be more of a threat to itself than probably anyone else. But as soon as you get the knife away from him, problem kind of solved. But you're dealing with a dead child now, and
zombie toddler.
So now the fact that it's clutching a sharp object just is somehow way more menacing. What else can it do?
Yeah, and there's a sense of what's behind the familiar that I mean, this idea of concealment, is ineffective concealment because it gives something away, but it also doesn't show you all of its abilities either. For instance, the Terminator, just because you shoot the Terminator in the face and it removes one of its eyes through self-surgery, and then you see this glowing red Terminator eyeball underneath, you don't know what the whole Terminator looks like. You don't know what it's capable of. All you know is that it's not human and it's dangerous. And, I mean, don't get me wrong. I like the moment in the Terminator where they burn off all of the tissue and it's walking after them and they have this stop motion kind of stuff. And it's creepy in its own kind of way because it has this jarring kind of robotic look to it due to the nature of the special effects they used with stop motion. And now imagine a human looking like that. Or in the case of that classic Gothic trope of the large humanoid threat. And you have in the hallway, the dark hallway, you have this skeleton. It's literally a skeleton who's walking after them, but it's kind of, in its case, it's sort of shiny, but it also has shadows and stuff. It's the skeleton in the movie, they actually painted with like grime and oil so that it wasn't just shiny and chrome. It was also tenebrous with these glowing red eyes. So there's this sense of the dark, hulking humanoid shape.
So would it be fair to call this concept of the large, the looming...
The Hulk.
Or a juggernaut of sorts? Because
yes.
it makes me think of, was it Mr. X from the...
Resident Evil 2?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect example. The stranger, the tall, powerful stranger, that denoting of great power of figure. The question was, is it uncanny?
Well, I mean, it's just... I guess not... Well, I guess in some cases you can consider it uncanny. But just more as a trope, I guess. A trope where... and there's kind of a cowering effect too when you're being sort of chased down by this tireless thing. But here's where the uncanny sort of comes in to play as a hunting device, where it's not sprinting after you. Oh, no.
It has kind of a human hunting technique where it follows its prey until its prey gets tired and collapses from exhaustion. So that's actually that's a very old...
That's never actually been confirmed, though. People have tried to set up experiments, but...
Well, in any case, the concept is at work. And in humans, I'm pretty sure if you chase someone nonstop until they can't sleep, then sooner or later they're going to make a mistake.
Well, that's kind of the premise of It Follows.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yes. It
never runs. It's always walking.
And you'll notice that with something like Mr. X from Resident Evil,
he just walks fast.
when it's walking fast, it's also giving you an opportunity to look at it. But when you look at it, you're seeing something uncanny, which confuses you. So the more you look at it, the more confused you get, and the less you want to run. Now, in the case of it, it is this big, powerful thing. And it also punches through walls and does all kinds of things that indicates that it's going to fuck you up royally if it gets its hands on you. But what's interesting about it is just the information of you looking at it. Like, okay, I'm going to look at this right now, and what do I see? I see a big, tall... I'm confused. That's and when you're trying to work all this shit out like in an instant... then it's walking towards you gradually. Instead of being like a cheetah, it's evolved to be more like...
I mean, it's humanoid, but clearly not human. It's not actually a human being. But close enough to where, I feel like it kind of triggers something in the back of your mind that's like you want to connect to it. Communicate, maybe, or just
there are multiple... You're having multiple responses.
And it's not really it's not showing aggressive, a threat display kind of thing. It's just walking at you fast. I mean, if it catches you, it's going to fuck you up. But, it's not running. It's not...
Well, it's not... It doesn't... Its chest doesn't open up and all these knives don't, shoot out of it. It's not that type of abject monstrosity. Yeah. It's a man in a trench coat. And Terminator, you got Kyle Reese in a trench coat. And he looks kind of dangerous, right? You're not really sure if he's good or bad. And then you have Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's this big, tall guy. He's just the guy walking around, right? And in both of those situations, you're not sure who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. And it turns out that Kyle Reese does have a shotgun under there. But he's going to use it on the Terminator. And the Terminator, despite the fact that he's walking around, also has a concealed weapon. In the case of the Terminator, he's hunting Sarah Connor. In the case of Kyle Reese, he's hunting the Terminator, and Sarah Connor is afraid of both of them. That predator-prey sort of relationship and the mentality of the prey organism.
There's just certain behaviors you expect from a predator that's in pursuit of you, that walking...
is not one of them.
Yeah, with their hands down and... no expression, just that's not triggering anything
exactly, and but it makes it a more effective predator.
because it confuses you. It's
uncanny. Well, its approach to hunting is an uncanny approach.
Exactly.
And do animals tend to hunt that way normally? No. But here's what's interesting is that the approach, more often than not, tends to imply sort of an intelligence, like an intelligent form of hunting. Like the anglerfish, obviously it's an evolved behavior. They're just doing that instinctually. But what if something were intelligent? And most Gothic monsters are. There's a sense of like a hidden power, but also like a hidden sort of menace. Mm-hmm. And the uncanny makes you feel like you're being under attack, or you're being invaded, or you're being sort of chased down very deliberately by a monster that is overwhelming your senses in this uncanny kind of way. That's the uncanny for you.
Yeah.
It's something that you never forget it when you know it, but even if you know it, you never feel completely safe or completely in danger.
Yeah.
It's just fun to play around with.
Oh, yeah.
If people do it correctly. So many people don't. So many people, especially in Hollywood type films, tend to opt for something a bit like they get the uncanny out of the way and they just want to reveal the killer right off the bat instead of just kind of keeping him in the shadows. And you're like, people will ask, well, that's not realistic. What's the point of that? Well, the point of that is the uncanny, to give you a very special kind of experience.
It is very special. That's probably my favorite aspect of the Gothic is the uncanny. And horror that plays up the uncanny is going to result in a movie that I like. Because, The Shining is one of my favorites. Get Out is one of my favorites. Yeah. And that definitely plays up the uncanny. Cause,
yes. There's lots of moments.
Yeah.
But yeah, in any case, that's the uncanny. It's very important. It's as old as the Gothic itself. One might say older than the Gothic. It's a very primitive part of our brain that's becoming confused, and you see it everywhere, especially in like science fiction with robotics and stuff like that. So yeah, that's the uncanny. That's it for today's episode. If you liked what we discussed and want to support what we do, a link to the Patreon is in the description below. Any support helps. And until next time, thanks for watching. Take care.
Bye.